Well, welcome to this event. We managed to get through the strike, and then we got through a fire alarm. I hope there's no more fire alarms. But anyway, it's welcome to this wonderful room, which I've always loved. My name, by the way, just in case you don't know me, my name is Michael Cox. I arrived at the LSE about 25 years ago into the Department of International Relations. I then went on to set up what I think is called a think tank. It's called LSE IDEAS, which was on foreign policy, and it's still going. I think it's still going strong. And like many people here, very deeply attached to this particular school and this particular room. As you know, this is called the Shaw Library, which, by the way, is not named after George Bernard Shaw, but after his wife, Charlotte Payne Townsend, who has a not very good photograph at the back there, I think. And I think she deserves far more in the way of art. And behind us, of course, we've got the return of the Nicholson painting, which I'm told has been restored. George Bernard Shaw, in his typically funny way, said, very nice brickwork. The dog, I think, later on didn't come around. But anyway, it's great to be here, and we're talking about the Fabian Society in of itself, and we'll have some talking about that. But also we're talking about the Fabian Society and the LSE as well as part of it. That sets it off. I've been working for many years, too many years, on a kind of what I call a popular history of the school. And one of the things that I've had to do a lot of work in is looking at the very origins of it. And it's quite complicated, actually. So I'm going to say a few words firstly on the complicated, odd, strange relationship between the Fabian Society and the LSE. And then Tessa beside me is going to say something more about how has the LSE translated, I think if I put it correctly, Tessa, has it translated the original founder's vision into policy making itself? And then we're moving over to one of the historians of the Fabian Society, my friend Mr. Weatherby. And then we're going to move to Fabians and New Labour over here. And then at the end, Mr. Jomi, who's the General Secretary of the Fabian Society. I hope I've got you right there. I didn't want to demote you there for a moment. Is going to talk about how the Fabian Society is adapting to the modern world. I'll speak just for a few minutes, just on how it came about. And this is really a fascinating story. As you know, it sounds an awful thing to begin the lecture or talk for only about 10 minutes. How did this place come into being? And the obvious thing is to say, well, it was the Fabians, wasn't it? But of course, in some ways it was. Of course it was the Fabians, in some ways it was. The old Fabians. I've even got all the wonderful pamphlets going back to 1884. How poor are the poor? Why are the poor so poor? And there's some wonderful stuff there too, by the way. And it's very well worth re-examining. Very empirical, of course. It wasn't just Sidney Webb or the people. But in the end, what happened, and some of you may know this story anyway, a letter arrived at a farm in Surrey from a gentleman called Henry Hutchinson, or as he was known, Henry Hutch. It was from his solicitor. It couldn't have arrived from Mr. Hutchinson for a very obvious reason. The poor chap had committed suicide. He was in a very bad state in terms of his health. And he donated what looked something like £20,000 at the time, a very substantial sum of money, to the Fabian Society, of which Sidney Webb, I think, was a key player at that time, as we all know, more so than anybody else, I think, but although not the only one. And Sidney saw straight away that this was and Mr. Hutchinson, the great Henry Hutchinson, said this should be for propaganda purposes, political purposes. And George Bernard Shaw was very keen on this. Sidney had other ideas. And this is where Sidney's role comes into it. And it was a kind of I want to be very careful how I use my terms here, but it was a kind of way of moving the original bequest, which was to go to the Fabian Society, to the purposes of education. And of course, Sidney already had, with others, been discussing the setting up of a school of economics, and I should add also the other part, and political science. Now, we can go into the reasons what Sidney's and Beatrice's and Graham Wallace's views were of education why it was important in the 1890s. It's quite complicated. It's about making Britain efficient. It's about making Britain competitive. It's about doing things that Oxford and Cambridge weren't doing. And I've always thought that the LSE was set up really as we are not Oxbridge. And there's a wonderful phrase, you get these in Beatrice's diaries and in her wonderful book, A Partnership, where she said, it shouldn't be in South Kensington. Now, it took me ages to work out what that phrase actually meant, why it shouldn't be in South Ken. But it's in essence, I think, because Sydney, again, I mentioned Sydney many times here, so please forgive the other three. But I think he meant it, he wanted it to be close to power. He wanted to be close to places which made decisions about society. And I think that this was not an accidental choice. I mean, if you look at the pictures of Houghton Street at that time, Clare Market, I mean, really, this was a pretty rundown place. And it didn't even come here, first of all, it's across the road, just behind the Strand. And funded too, by the way, by Charlotte Payne Townsend, who paid for the first room over in John Street. But he said, look, we need it to be close to the heart of power, where decisions are made, and that is what we want to influence. I think you'll pick up on some of that too, Tessa. Namely, we want to have impact. This horrible word that's used all the time now. We're all supposed to have impact, aren't we? And so he put it between the three centres of power. And it was quite deliberate and quite conscious. It would be near the law courts, next door, or just across the road, very important. It would be nearer to the City of London, to money. And Sydney was always very, very, very well aware of the need for philanthropic support. Henry Hutchinson's was, after all, a philanthropist. Others made other donations, including quite a lot of financiers from the City of London. And of course, he also wanted it to be near Westminster. He even located their house along from the House of Commons, from the House of Lords, along Grosvenor Road on the embankment, in order to be close to the decision makers. Sydney once said, there are 2,000 people in this country who matter. and they tried to have dinner with nearly all of them. Although I'm told the dinners weren't much fun, because Beatrice didn't believe in alcohol too much anyway. And make terrible food as well. Yeah, Virginia Woolf often complained about going to dinner there. Oh dear, not again. Anyway, but it was I think I still look at this in a way as the most extraordinary experiment. Again, Beatrice always with a bon mot said, this is a very odd adventure. And it may have failed. It may have failed. There's again a wonderful letter from Sydney to Beatrice, I think about 1897, 1898. They're running into problems financially. They're only doing part-time students. They're not doing full-time degrees. You know, they don't really have proper, you know, it's really quite a chancy business. He said, well, it may go under. But at least we've tried. At least we've tried. It didn't go on, and I think we're all very happy that it didn't. We're all sitting in this room talking about that. But the Fabian relationship was, in a sense, a direct, but not such a direct one, because Sydney was always aware, as indeed was Beatrice, as much. George Bernard Shaw less so. Gerald GBS a little bit less so. Very well aware that he had to kind of play a very delicate game. After all, this is the only university, school I should call it, established by socialists. There may be others around the world, I'm sure there are, in different parts, but in this country, socialists normally were not in the game of setting up universities. So it is the only one. So he was quite well aware of its original ideological and political vocation. On the other hand, he had to play in a world of money, of philanthropy, of prejudice, to some degree also against the school, you can imagine. You know, it did have this kind of Fabian origin, collectivist purpose. And I thought the brilliance of the Webbs was actually managing that balance. And of course, within a very short period of time, the library got established, a wonderful library we have. They got more money in, largely through a wonderful Cornishman, by the way, Passmore Edwards, who established one of the first real buildings here. Gave 11,000, and money came from the Castle Foundation and various many others who founded it. So it does have a clear relationship with the Fabians. And I'd also like to suggest, and I'll end my brief introductory rambling comments here, it was always one that had to be managed carefully. So that the school seemed at one level to be a kind of university, doing very different things to any other universities, social sciences, accountancy, trade, and very many other things as well. It did a lot of things that nobody else was doing, and did it in a concentrated form as social sciences. It was the only one of its kind. It wasn't like King's across the road or UCL up in Bloomsbury, and certainly wasn't like Oxbridge at all. It drew very heavily on Oxbridge academics too, by the way, because at first they didn't have very much money to pay many people. But anyway, that's kind of part of it. And I love that relationship with the Fabians as well, because it is part of a Fabian project, but it's not the only thing the Fabians created, as you well know. The New Statesman was created in 1913. Other publications came out, as you know, in the 1930s. One of the things I'd also say about the Fabians, and maybe I'll make this as my last point. As you know, a very famous economist came here in 1930-31 called Hayek. And I'm not sure the Webbs were entirely happy about the appointment for obvious reasons. He was appointed by what I call one of the big beasts of the school, Lionel Robbins, who made an enormous impact on the school, part of the Austrian School of Economics, by the way, very interesting. Certainly not in the Fabian tradition, I think you could say straight away, Tessa, couldn't we? But later on, we were talking about this. Later on, of course, Hayek went to Chicago after having written The Road to Serfdom, which got serialized in the Reader's Digest. So if you ever want to get published, by the way, make sure it gets serialized in the Reader's Digest. I'm not sure it's even going now, is it? But anyway, it got serialized. It became very famous, made a lot of money out of it. Later on, he went on to set this thing called the Mount Pelerin Society, which was to do for the market and what you might call the conservative right, what the Fabians had done here. And in a sense, what Hayek was doing was providing a very big backhanded compliment to the impact that the Fabians had. I think that's really important to get. He kind of said, and he actually said this, I think, in a letter, I can't remember to whom, I saw it somewhere, and I can't remember the source. What the Webbs did was brilliant. What the Fabian Society managed to do was brilliant. You know, they moved from nothing in 1884 to indirectly to a university, to publications, to transforming the Labour Party in 1918 with the new constitution. And who wrote that constitution? It was Sidney Webb. Now we can go on and follow, you know, the political and ideological evolution of the Webbs into the 1930s and the Soviet Union, or was it a civilization, with or without a question mark? We could talk about all that, but it was actually saying that the Fabians played an absolutely critical role, although an indirect one, in the creation of the school. And I think my own view, my own background being what it is, you know, I clearly do want to see that kind of tradition of the school. We live in a different world. We all know that everything's changed. It's not late 1890s anymore. But I'm still very of the opinion, a very strong opinion in my view, anyway, that origin still needs to shape much of not much, but a good part of what the school should remain. And there are many pressures now not to maintain that tradition, in my opinion. And I want to see many of those traditions still maintained. And anyway, that's what we're going to talk about this evening. Those are just a few comments just to set the ball rolling. And I'll hand over to Tessa Blackstone, who knows more about the LSE than I do, I think. Tessa, over to you.
Very much indeed, Mick. I think I can pick up on your last remarks in the few words that I'm going to say, and I'm going to be quite brief because I know that there's a good audience here of people who know a lot about this subject, indeed much more than I do. But I want to just start from some of the points that Mick has made about the history of the relationship between the Fabian Society and the London School of Economics. So my starting point is that the intention of the founders, Beatrice and Sidney behind us, plus Wood Burnshaw and a number of others too, was to found an institution which could educate and train people who would play a central role in the provision of public services in Great Britain, as it then was. That was very central to what they wanted to do, as well as trying to develop new ideas for a left-of-centre government that they hoped would exist and continue. But they wanted to see civil servants, local government officials, people who were involved in administrating and innovating in the wider public sector to get some kind of education in the issues that they should consider, how they should analyse the problems that the country was facing, which I didn't really think was happening in the Oxford and Cambridge of those days. So that's my starting point. That's what the founders wanted. And I think for many years, the London School of Economics fulfilled the ambitions of the founders, often contributing new ideas on the working of the welfare state, jointly with the Fabian Society, pamphlet writing, preparing talks for various different organizations, weekend schools with the Fabians, conferences with them, as well as in other contexts, like advising select committees in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, going back to your point about Sidney wanting to be near what he saw as the powerful and the 2,000 people who run this country. I'm now going to just personalize this a little bit more. You said you've been here you came here 25 years ago. I was just working out. I actually came here over 40 years ago. So I can go back rather further. But I was very fortunate, I think, in that I came to study sociology with some economics as an undergraduate. And then I registered and did a PhD here. And then 2 years into my PhD, when I barely started it really, I was appointed to an assistant lectureship in the Department of Social Administration, as it then was. Now, I say I was very fortunate because that department, I think, more than any other in the school, epitomized what the early founders wanted. It was led at that time by Richard Titmuss, the leading thinker about the welfare state, author of many books on it, including perhaps his most brilliant book, which was about the whole issue of blood donation. The gift relationship, it was called, which it was used as a way of hanging many of his ideas about what a welfare state should be like. David Donaldson was another professor who was an expert on housing, but also became totally engaged in the delivery of public services by becoming the chairman of the Social Benefits, the Supplementary Benefits Commission. And Brown Abel Smith, who was a health expert, who became a special advisor in the Department of Health and Social Security in the Labour government when it was elected. So there were my three bosses who were all intertwined with government policy making. And I had many colleagues who worked in different areas of public policy, doing research and teaching at both undergraduate and postgraduate level, people who would want to go and do the kind of jobs that the founders of this institution thought its graduates should do. It also had a section of the department training social workers. That has long since gone. And it did a wide range of policy-related social research, helping to produce more evidence-based policy making in government and beyond. There are other departments too who did work that was relevant to public policy, international relations, criminologists, one of them is here, my old colleague David Downs, who was in the social policy department, but Paul Rock, who was in the sociology department, who worked with the Home Office. There were people in the economics department, like Richard Layard, who set up the Centre for Economic Performance and worked on the economics of labour and unemployment policies. The government department in those days, I think, didn't really do very much in relation to thinking about...
Not after Lasky.
No, not after Lasky. It became rather inward-looking, in my view. There may be people here who will say otherwise about it, and I'd be interested. Yeah, you can say that. But either agreeing or disagreeing. But I feel that the LSE in the last quarter of a century has lost its way. in relation to those early ambitions and is not really doing as much as it should be. And I think there are two reasons for this. There are two important drivers of its priorities. The first is the search for national and global dominance in world league tables on research. It wanted to be seen way beyond the boundaries of this country as a top research institution. Fine, that's a perfectly acceptable ambition, but it had a cost. And that is, I think, a neglect of teaching, especially of undergraduates, and not enough thought about the employment of the graduates of this institution. And it was secondly, I think, driven by the search for much, much higher fee income, and that drove it into a relentless pursuit of overseas students. Now, I have to say that as a minister responsible for post-16 education and training, part of my job, for quite a large part of that time, was to promote the Prime Minister's initiative to recruit more international students. So I don't in any way want to say that it's wrong to promote and recruit students from around the world. But at LSE, that has turned into having large numbers of master's degrees with no British students on them at all. I think that's deeply shocking. I think it's very bad for the overseas students who do not meet British students on their courses. And I think it has locked out quite substantial numbers of British postgraduates who wanted to come and do a graduate program here because the fees were so large, they hadn't been able to afford them. And whilst I can see that we might get some brownie points around the world for effectively educating young people from China, Singapore, Hong Kong, the United States to become good bankers. Again, it's a very long way from the Fabians and the LSE as it started. So I'm critical now. And I can see, I'm concede that, I'm making a case, and there are, of course, exceptions to this. There are people doing excellent work on climate change, people who have thought a lot about the policy implications of all of that. But I also feel, and this is my last point, that too little work has been done in the LSE to recruit disadvantaged students at the undergraduate level. So it's become a Russell Group institution that is competing for students with 2 A's and an A star. So it's very undiverse in terms of the academic ability of the young people who come here. And I think they should have far more contextual recruitment where they look at the social background of the students concerned, and those who come from families with no history of university education, kids who had free school meals and have managed to get an A and 2 Bs. That's brilliant if you come from that sort of background and you haven't had all the leg ups that kids from well-off middle-class families and independent schools would have had. So that, I think, is another failure. There's no single FE college that has a relationship with LSE these days. Not just about schools, incidentally. Half of all 16-year-olds in full-time education are in FE colleges. And I think that, the very last point I would make is that I feel that there should be more lifelong learning opportunities here too, supporting the intellectual and managerial skills of UK public servants through short courses done which will bring them up to date in various different areas of public policy making and the social sciences. I think I would like to see an LSE that's much closer to what the Webbs wanted, and to see them focusing more today on preparing young people to work in the British public services system and not in banks in Hong Kong, China, and Singapore.
Cecil, thank you very much. I think that's very, very clear. And,
I think that's going to open up quite a lot of debate and discussion about the function of the LSE today. But before we do that, Michael, we're going to turn over to you to talk broadly speaking about the history more of the Fabian Society. You can mention the LSE until about the 1960s. I know you've written about this before. Yeah, that one's on. Yeah,
That one.
that one.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. It's I don't know if Daniel remembers, we met, I think, 9 months ago to try and get some events in place. And it's fantastic to see this one taking place. And we've got another later in the month I'll talk about. But I'm going to do quite a focused talk here on the history of the Fabian Society. And it gives me an opportunity to play with history in a way I love to teach my students. By the way, I'm based at Imperial College, South Kensington. I've just learned how powerless my daily life is, but sorry to hear. Maybe I should move to the LSE. I studied philosophy of science here actually many years ago, and it was really fascinating. So the Fabian Society slogan now is the future of the left since 1884, and I copied from the Wikipedia page to advance the principles of social democracy and democratic socialism by gradualist and reformist efforts in democracies rather than by revolutionary overthrow. It's been made famous again by the BBC Reith Lectures, some maybe 6 months ago, Bregman, praising the efforts a small group of people can have on a much larger group of people. I know that history has been contested also subsequently. We all know about the LSE. You mentioned the New Statesman. I'm sure everyone else knows as well that the Fabians have reportedly had influence on large numbers of other countries throughout the 20th century. Australia, New Zealand, they both still have Fabian societies. Singapore, India, Pakistan, and more. We're still going through the historical record through the mid-20th century to track this. And also in the last year, for whatever reason, there's been really interesting, imaginative theories being spread largely on social media about the enormous impact the Fabian Society has had in the last 140 so years. Now, when I teach my students history, I want them to, I have to convey, you're allowed to challenge history in a big way, right? You can change periodizations if it's convincing. You write an essay that convinces me World War I finishes in 1919, get an A, yeah? World War II started in 1936, you can argue that, you get good points for that. And one of the things that historians really love is periodization, because it crystallizes the version of history and it enables the narrative they want to tell. So I just picked up 2 books about this and compared them. Margaret Cole, The Story of Fabian Socialism, 1961, split the period before that into 5 separate periods. Yeah, and I'm not, by all means, come up and ask me afterwards which ones they are. I've got them written down. But then, interestingly, fast forward to 2014. This is the 130th anniversary of the LSE. 2014 was the 130th anniversary of the Fabian Society. Andy Harrop, Joe's predecessor, who was also a very nice guy, he split the history of the Fabians into 2, saying the Cole version was simply collectivist, which I think a term you used, and subsequent, he said that the subsequent 60, 70 years was an egalitarian interpretation of the Fabian sort of duty, as it were. And the provocation, the question I want to actually ask here is, do we continue with egalitarianism, if that's what we think the purpose of the Fabians is now? Or do we look at it and go, perhaps we're in another 3-generational shift and we move into a new phase of Fabian history? And if so, what is it? And what would we call it? What would we like it to be called? Yeah, I'll come back to this point at the end. Now, I've been, again, studying the material in preparation for this wonderful event, and I think there's 3 different ways to interpret Fabian history. The most popular, and I'll tell you, I can explain why it's popular if you want to ask me, is that it's been a very long continuous existence. It's a very useful historical narrative. It's been very influential, pretty continuously influential for that large 140 plus year period. The subsequent one, which is much less well known now, this was Eric Hobsbawm's PhD thesis at Cambridge in the late 1940s, was that the Fabians were well known, but they actually hadn't been influential. They were stealing the credit from more authentic working class organizations, trade unions, and the Independent Labour Party. So that thesis is not well remembered now. Yeah. And then the third one, which is I'm going to convey here and hope you to convince you of in these few minutes, is we have a yes, sometimes influential, but an organization which adapts, which is it ebbs and flows and has a more kind of jagged history than you might realize. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this next section. So something you don't hear about in this, because of the style of the language we use, of continuity and gradualism and reformism and so on, we assume this applies to the Fabian Society itself for 140 something years. Actually, the Fabian Society has split or nearly split twice. 1930s, under the Webbs, you mentioned their gigantic book on Stalin, which is one of the most misleading books you can ever read. But
With or without the question.
without the question mark, what is not well known is 1931 to 8, the younger generation led by G.D.H. Cole, Clement Attlee, Harold Lasky and others were running the new Fabian Research Bureau as a separate organisation. They merged in 1938, largely under the leadership, I understand it from reading the archives, of the younger generation. The Webbs kind of took so with Margaret Cole, G.D.H. Cole as the essentially new leadership, right? And the NFRB has, in my opinion, not been studied fully enough, and that's one of my particular passions for visiting the archive here, is to understand that. And also in the 1980s, of course, several of the, you may remember this, so several of the leadership of the Fabian Society left Labour to form the SDP. Yeah, and the debate there, yeah, which may not be, is it true that you had to debate which party gets the Fabians?
No, it didn't quite work like that. What happened, I mean, Tessa was there too, was that the rules of the Fabian Society mean you can be a member of the Fabian Society and no other political party, but you cannot be a member of the Fabian Society and another political party that's not the Labour Party. And so that was the big constitutional fight that was going on in 1981, because people who left and went to the Social Democratic Party said, but we're still Fabians. And we had to go through quite a very difficult period to decide, no, you're not.
Thank you. Exactly. And more.
So this was Shirley Williams and people like that.
I did more disrupted history than we might.
If I could just add one
yeah, sure.
just on the history side of it, if we take the early Webbs and their theory of change, it didn't actually, first of all, run through the Labour Party. They had a theory of permeation in which you could try and influence anybody who was around at the time who might buy into some part of what you believed in. So they worked with Winston Churchill, by the way. They worked with the Liberal Party. And the orientation ultimately towards the Labour Party came slightly later. So there's a precedent, isn't there? I think on that as well.
I'm going to mention that. No. It's great to hear you've got the same points in mind. But they don't fit into the smooth historiography of the Fabian Society at all, right? This is a resilient, renewing organisation that changes itself. That's my main point of this talk. They found it to permeate the Liberal Party because it was the party of workers, business, obviously, but trade unions, workers, compared to the Conservative Party, which is the party of the church, the aristocracy, and the land, right? And so it's also rewritten its constitution numerous times. The clause you mentioned didn't used to be in it. And then G.D.H. Cole had rewritten it before then, because the Communist Party arguably had tried some kind of a takeover. Labour was... Anyway, we'll get out the weeds. But also some stuff you may not know about. This perceived success of the Fabian Society led to, in 1929, the Conservative Party founding Ashridge College. There's a whole building, it's still there, it's a business school now. There's a great study by Clarice Bertha-Zen, mostly in French, she did a short study in English, that said it was created, they wanted to create conservative Fabians because they thought the Fabian model had been really successful. Speaking of which, picking up on a mixed point, the Fabian model had been also interesting to Friedrich von Hayek, Karl Popper and Lionel Robbins, who arguably emulated its structure and strategy in order to set up the Montpellier Society and what we now think of as
a battle of ideas.
Neoliberalism, as it's sometimes called, which has arguably been very successful. So these are not contained within the Fabian Society history, but they can carry it further on. Just to finish up some remarks here on this. So the current projects we're doing, because I'm the kind of resident historian within the Fabians. I hope, Joe, that's right. He's also my boss because I'm on the executive, but he's the leader.
I know you're...
Oh, I'm his boss. Okay, great to hear. Great to hear.
So we don't believe in bosses, do we?
So the two projects were G.D.H. Cole. I think he's quite well known, but not as well known as he needs to be. I think as whatever crazy political period we're going through right now, his thoughts on organizational form and power and authority and the role of voice and control, I think, are really interesting, especially with all the new technologies being deployed in the workplace and at home. And who actually really runs anything? This is the kind of question he was asking 100 years ago, and how he met Margaret Cole, actually. His archive is mostly in Oxford University. It's okay as well. I may have studied there in the past. Cole, just in case you don't know, his recent biographer, Matt Dawson, charted that Cole and GDH and Margaret Cole published 136 books and 389 articles between them, which is an Stakhanovite extraordinary, and it's really good stuff as well. But what I wanted to convey is the research, particularly we're going to be working on, nearly done, There is his time at the Amalgamated Society of Engineers when he had to speak to the Ministry of Munitions, huge organisation. The NFRB I already mentioned. And then later in life, he was in a senior role at UNESCO. And we talk about the global structures and all this. And I'm very interested how his notions of control and authority at a local level would have intermixed with that. The other one is the local society representative on the committee is by finding local history of the Fabian Society. It's framed as a managerial centralizing organization. There's thousands of local members and hundreds of local societies that we don't know the history of at all. That's why I'm really excited we're coming here later this month, facilitated by our colleagues with many local societies to research their own history, often for the very first time. And we'll find out ways to get that onto the internet and so on. I just want to finish something. So if we could think forward to the year 2100, please. Why? Because that's another 60 to 70 years from now, another 3-generational leap. The sort of historical periodization that Andy Harrop had applied 12 years ago. I would love to know, and I want to start the conversation, what should the next phase be like? In 2100, what do we want to be described as historically? And I would love to know this and for your opinions on that. Indeed, if you look at the Fabian window over there, which no one's mentioned, look at it during the drinks. At the top, it says, remold it nearer to the heart's desire. And the question is, what do we want? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great stuff.
And now pass over to Glenys. I think the front is Fabians and New Labour, I think.
Well, I thought, yes. Yeah, it's great to be here. I am both as an alum and as a Fabian. I was a student here in 1973 to 1976. So I straddled two of the directors that you've got up there. And I was pleased actually to be a governor of the school for many years. And you know when you've been shoved upstairs because they give you a title called Emeritus, which is what I am now. I know you're one of those too, yes. Well, it means, as far as I can tell it means you get invited to everything, but you have no responsibility, so it's very good. I joined the Labour Party in 1974, and I joined the Fabians around the time of 1980-81. So, and then I worked at the Fabians in the 1990s as both Director of Development, which is a very smart term for fundraiser, and as General Secretary for 1 year when the permanent General Secretary, Simon Crine, was doing a Hartnett Scholarship. But actually, what a year that was. That was 1993 to 94, when we as the Labour Party lost our beloved leader, John Smith. We had a leadership election, which was won by Tony Blair. And that period, 92 to 97, was the creation of New Labour and the New Labour agenda, which is what I really wanted to sort of talk about tonight, because A, there are some things which people will recognise in there, and B, I think it probably is the sort of thing the Fabian Society has been doing before general elections that Labour has won. But before I do that, I also want to say that in the year I was General Secretary, I started the drive to move the Fabian archives into the LSE. And the reason I did that was because they were not being cared for. In fact, things were being stolen from them in the place that they were before, somewhere in Oxford. Why it wasn't here in the first place is a bit of a mystery, really. But from 1992 to 97, the Fabians played an important role in helping to develop the New Labour project. And they did that in a couple of ways, two main ways. The first was a series of pamphlets, of course it was a series of pamphlets, which were called Southern Discomfort. 3 pamphlets, which were about the reasons for the 1992 devastating defeat, which Labour suffered. And, you know, we weren't supposed to lose that election. They were written by the late Giles Medici, a good friend of mine and even greater friend of Tessa's, and also used focus group research, which at that time was actually regarded as pretty it was controversial, and also we got condemned partly because we did that. And that research was funded by the Inland Revenue Staff Association, as I recall, at the time, a trade union. And what those studies of marginal seats in the south of England, we were concerned about, well, what they showed was Labour's lack of economic credibility and the fears that people had if they'd elected the party and Neil Kinnock, that their taxes would have increased. So we did it in 5 constituencies: Gravesham, Harlow, Luton South, Slough and Stevenage. They were the focus of that research. We had only won 10 seats in the south of England. If you don't count London, if you draw a line from the Wash to Bristol, 10 seats. Labour had one in 92. So we had a big problem. By the time the work was published, John Smith had taken over from Neil as the leader. We did then issue the second Southern Discomfort pamphlet a year later, which is why Southern votes mattered, tax, spending and benefits, and the lessons for Labour. And basically they said things like, the Southern floating voters feel let down by the Tories but do not trust Labour. They think Labour is an old-fashioned party, remote from their concerns and aspirations, wedded to high taxation, extravagant expenditure, and not competent to run the country. So despite their disgust with the Tory government, they still believed they would win the next election. And from this emerged recommendations, which did include, to demonstrate that we understand the modern world, we should rewrite Labour's Clause 4. And then the final Fabian pamphlet, published in September 1994, included the marginal seats from the Midlands to test the theory that political attitudes of Labour's lost voters in the South were increasingly shared by similar voters in other parts of the country. And it concluded, at a time when voters are deeply sceptical about politicians, the Labour Party has to earn their trust. By then, Tony Blair had become leader of the party. And the authors note that the voters' question had an initial good impression of him. There were people in the party who didn't appreciate the policy which flowed from these publications, which were things like a recognition and appreciation of aspiration and a need to demonstrate that we could deliver economic growth and stability. The second important aspect of that period was the Fabian Society gave a platform to the people who ultimately became the New Labour's founders and actors. After John Smith had led the Labour Party to decide one member, one vote reform, he and other members of the party had decided that was enough modernisation, we didn't need any more. But I think the Fabian Society provided a platform necessary for the modernisation of our party to go forward. So when John Smith died, there was a sort of precipitated as helping to heal. The Fabians helped to heal the Labour Party and take us forward to the next bit. So those are the highlights of a period that seems to me reflected in other contributions and perhaps will be confirmed by Joe when he speaks about the Fabian Society's role in the run-up to elections and for Labour forming a government. Instrumental in bringing forward new ideas, publishing proposals, hosting discussions. I can remember a young woman speaking about very complex financial instruments and what Labour should be doing about them at a series of lunchtime seminars in our basement. That was Yvette Cooper. I can remember a Fabian pamphlet by Ed Balls proposing the independence of the Bank of England in that period. So I don't think it's an accident over the last 130 years that the Fabian Society and the New Statesman have been the policy and debate machines. And the LSE actually often produced the thinkers, the civil servants, the legal leaders, and which helped take us into government. And I agree with Tessa that I think it's a great shame that the LSE is actually not doing that third bit like it used to do.
Thank you very much. Yes, just one maybe to give a very quick intervention for Joe. One of the biggest schools came directly, very good at it. And the third way, and in some ways, I'm not sure Tony wasn't not a member of the Fabian Society, but I think many of the arguments that he put forward in advance and popularised. And Tony was a great lecturer and remains so, I think, even to this day, I hope. But I haven't seen him for some years because we became quite a good friend. But I always thought Tony played an enormous role. And the other thing that Tony did really, really effective, apart from the loving lecture, which was very important, connected with the students. The other thing he did, of course, was to connect with Bill Clinton. across the Atlantic. I think this was again built, I think it came in 2-3 times in the 1990s. Formulated a kind of, this wasn't just a British thing, this was a wider response to the end of the Cold War. It was a wider response to the change in the global economy. And we have to adapt to that kind of world. It's called the third way. That's a great term, but it's very interesting to bring back that LSE prevention. And of course, it was Tony Blair who came here when we refound the Fabian glass over there, and I did the speech here with Tony sitting very close by. Joe, pass over to you now. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say, and then we'll open up Q&A.
Thank you very much. My name is Joe Dromey, and I'm the General Secretary of the Fabian Society. And for those of you who aren't hugely familiar with us, I'm sure the vast majority of you are. We're a membership organisation and a think tank that's committed to building a more equal economy and society through evidence-based, democratic and progressive reform. And as you've heard, we were founded in 1884 by a group of committed socialists. So LSE is but a young'un compared to us at the Fabian Society. And the impetus behind this was because the group who came together saw the stark inequality that marked their era and rejected it. And they recognised that this inequality was a social disease. It was a failing not of the individual, but of the economy and of the political system that underpinned that economy. And it was something that could be fixed. But the founding Fabians also rejected revolutionary Marxism. So they realised that and recognised that the best way to change their society and to deliver the lasting improvements that they wanted to see for the lives of workers and the poor was through democratic, evidence-based reform. So they rejected both the scarring inequality of their day and also the kind of revolutionary Marxist approach. So it was a gradual reformist socialism. And those founding Fabians would leave a lasting legacy. So they made the case for ideas which at the time seemed bold and indeed revolutionary, but not in a literal sense, but transformative, bold, radical ideas which are now prosaic and normal and seen as things that would be obvious to most of us. So universal publicly funded education, progressive taxation, protection for workers, public housing and public pensions, universal healthcare, and votes for women, all were championed by the Fabian Society before they were won. And they made the case for these transformative ideas through diligent research, public education, and pushing for progressive democratic reform, as you heard initially mainly through the Liberal Party and then through the Labour Party, who the Fabian Society indeed helped found along with the trade unions. So in 1894, a group of these founding Fabians, as you heard, led by Beatrice and Sidney Webb behind us, that founded, based on the funding for the bequest, a new institution which was dedicated to the serious study of society, economy and politics. And their ambition, as ever, was radical for its time. They wanted to create a centre of research that could help address poverty and inequality and the great social questions facing Britain at the turn of the century. And the result was this institution, the London School of Economics. We remain hugely proud of the founding Fabians' role in establishing this institution. And throughout the 20th century, there has been a strong connection between the Fabians and the LSE. So Fabian thinkers have taught here, and also LSE academics have contributed to Fabian Society events and collections. And both institutions have helped shape discussions around the welfare state, around public services, economic management and social justice. So people like Harold Lasky, Richard Titmuss, as we've heard, Brian Abel-Smith, were deeply ingrained in both institutions, and they carried forward the tradition of combining intellectual rigour, but with a concern for real-world practical reform. So not just sort of esoteric, theoretical discussion for its own sake, fun though that might be and worthy though it is, thinking about a different world in order to help build that different world. And the LSE has gone on to become one of the world's leading centres for social science. It has very high quality scholarship, obviously, and it's helped transform our understanding of economics, politics, public administration, and social policy. But I think, as Mick and Tessa have both alluded to, the approach to higher education policy in recent years has encouraged, incentivised, pushed universities, required them indeed to commercialise in many ways, and to focus on financial success and scale and reach. And as Tessa says, I do think that's had some impact here. I think it's been resisted more than many institutions, but it has had some impact here. And I think it's always important to remember that those things, financial success, scale and reach, must be a means to an end and not an end in and of itself. And as Mick said, it's the only university that is founded by socialists. And the aim of the LSE, set out by the Webbs, is the betterment of society through scientific study of economic, social and political questions. So I think that's a really important thing to kind of remain focused on. And LSE can play a crucial role here in educating leaders across politics, the economy and society, and indeed in educating the wider public, in supporting the understanding of society and society's ills, and in improving decision making in order to address those ills. The Fabian Society remains committed to the ideals based on which we were founded over 140 years ago. We believe that ideas matter and that change is possible. And in terms of what we do now, it's in many ways similar to when Glenys worked at the Fabian Society, and similar to decades before. In fact, I read, just when I was applying for the role, I read a history of the Fabian Society, which was written in, I think, 1892. Yeah. So you can see how old an organisation is when you're reading a history which is over 130 years old. And there was much of what the Fabian Society does now that it was resonant there. So producing high quality research on the key policy and political issues of our time, holding events and conferences to support debate and discussion, and also crucially, not claiming a monopoly on wisdom. So we're not one of these think tanks that only publishes our own work, only talks about our own work and thinks our own work is the be all and end all. We provide a space for debate and discussion for people to write about ideas in Fabian Review, to challenge our ideas as well. And if anyone is interested in writing for us, I would very much welcome that. And we believe that this work, that the Fabian approach, matters more today than ever before. So we live in a world that is facing some existential challenges, yawning inequality, which has risen again effectively to the levels that we last saw in the Belle Epoque when the Fabian Society was founded. Stagnant growth and stagnant living standards, and many challenges which are international in nature, from the climate crisis and forced migration, regulation of powerful new technologies like AI, and challenges to peace and security. Yet the international order which we need to address these international issues is breaking down before our very eyes. And in my view, too much of our politics today is often too thin and too fickle. Political leaders today often seem to offer merely vibes, platitudes, and slogans rather than evidence. Too many seek to whip up and channel rage rather than tackling the social ills that generate that rage. And too many politicians have retreated to a narrow nationalism which cannot deal with the international challenges of our time. Just as Glenys's work the Fabians helped shape the programme of the last Labour government, we, prior to me joining in early 2025, we helped shape Labour's programme in the run-up to the last election. So we set out the blueprint for the National Care Service. We helped to shape the reforms in the Employment Rights Bill, which have delivered a huge shift in the balance of power in the labour market. And we shaped Labour's plans for devolution to give power back to local communities. But I think it's fair to say that things have not gone quite to plan for the Labour government. It's partly due to the very, very deeply challenging inheritance that the government had, broken public services and an economy on its knees, public finances at breaking point. It's also partly due to the horrendous international context. You know, with Trump, I started my job on the same day that Donald Trump did. Unfortunately, have done slightly less damage. But I don't want to just make excuses. It is also clear that the government has faced a challenging situation, but has not handled it as well as it might have. And also, I think we need to look to, in understanding this, we need to look to what happened before the government started. And when he resigned a few weeks ago, Wes Streeting said that Labour had failed to prepare effectively for government because discussion and debate was seen as division, and ideas were not properly stress tested and challenged. And I think there's quite a lot in that analysis. And Streeting also called for a battle of ideas. I mean, you know, he is a combatant in that battle of ideas. He is seeking to challenge for the leadership. But I do think there is a lot in that too. I think Labour needs to renew its intellectual vitality so that it can use its majority that it's still got 3 years left with an enormous majority to transform the country and to take on the populist right. And the Fabian Society is keen to support in this debate and in discussion in the coming months. Just a final aside on, Michael mentioned the Conservative Fabians. There's also, I think, something which is quite similar to a Green Fabians that's just been set up in Verdant, this group that's been set up by James Medway, who's Verdant, yes, the appropriate name Verdant, which is trying to sort of incubate and provide those ideas into the Green Party, including some ideas with a bit of evidence and rigour and behind them, which I think is much needed. So the Fabian Society and the LSE were founded by the same people and for the same reasons. So the Webbs and their colleagues did not see knowledge as something separate from public life. They believe that scholarship should illuminate public choices. They believe that politicians and politics should learn from evidence. And they believe that democratic societies are strongest when ideas are tested through open debate and serious inquiry. And neither institution stood still. Both have evolved. But I think, as I mentioned before, what remains striking is how much of the vision of our founders and the approach that they took is still resonant today. That ideas matter and that change is possible. That debate and discussion are crucial to effective policy making and healthy politics and social progress. And that complex problems require serious thinking. And that finally, if we are to change and improve society, we must understand society. And that remains the challenge that we face, a challenge that's worthy of our founders, and I think a challenge that we share with the LSE. And the Fabian Society has, since its founding, been a membership organisation, bringing together people with the same ideals, people who are committed to building a more equal economy and society. So if you are not already a member of the Fabian Society, fear not, we can make amends. We would be delighted if you could join, just search for Join the Fabians, and I'd be delighted to have you join us. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll move on to Q&A. We're going to go on to about 8:30, I think, this evening. Is that right, Daniel? Thereabout? Whatever, yeah. I just wanted to pick up one or two, if I could just use the position of chair, pick up one or two of the things that Chester said, not by way of defence of the LSE today, but anyway. No, but it takes me back to one of the people in the picture behind me, Beatrice Webb. And if you read the biographies of Webb and read about her, I mean, this was an extraordinary woman who got her hands dirty. I mean, she went out to factories in Lancashire, she went out to in the East End of London, and she came from a very upper class background. And she played an absolutely vital role in all the things we've been talking about. I mean, for instance, on the poor law reform and on the minority report that she brought out in the early 1900s, it's extraordinary. Go back and read it. It's vital, it's empirical, and it's tough-minded. And, you know, that is part of the tradition, I think, Tessa, that we were very clear to and want to still see the LSE very much engaged in. I'm not saying we shouldn't do theory, but sometimes I do worry that the theoreticism that academics love to indulge in can sometimes take them away from those very, very real-world problems
which do need to be addressed, not just on poverty, but many, many other things. The other things they wrote a lot about, people often forget, is local government. You know, I mean, it's extraordinary to go back and look at all the things they wrote. Local government don't sound very interesting. Well, it's important. It's so vitally important. And many of the things they wrote about was about local government and what local government could do. And I'll also mention one other very, very interesting, and you mentioned the Social Policy Department, which you joined, Tessa, but that department went back to India, the Tata family, who put money into the school in 1911. R.H. Tawney, the great economic historian, became the director of it, and who was one of the people who then got a lectureship? Clement Attlee. And, you know, so again, very much engaged at that time. And Clement Attlee went on to write, I think, an extraordinary book. I don't know if many people read it other than me. It's called The Social Worker. And it starts with the poems of the Romantics. It's an extraordinary book by Clement Attlee. And of course, it was a 45 government, which was, I think it had 220 Fabians in it on the back pages. My other final point, and it's about internationalism. It seems to me that socialism has got to be internationalist, or it's nothing. It has to be. If it loses that connection with internationalism, it is on very thin ice. And I think, again, one of the things the school did, and I think still does, maybe it doesn't do it in the way we would always like, but it still sees itself as having an internationalist dimension, a very strong internationalist dimension. You know, you could see that in the webs. They were always very keen. They traveled to India. They traveled across the world. They were constantly wanting to make this a school, not just for London, but in some senses for the world as well. And I also want to make this final point, really. One of the very first statements, you talk about pamphlets, one that's often forgotten was written by Leonard Woolf in 1916, which really was the precursor to the origins of the League of Nations. It's a wonderful document by Leonard, who's a great man. Wife was a great person, great woman. But it's an amazing document about the need for internationalism. And I think, again, that's such an important part of, I think, the traditions of the LSE, which, of course, it shares with our Fabian. So, look, on that little peroration by me, getting it off my chest, I think we've got a lot of questions who want to come. If you could just stand up, tell us who you are, and just ask one question, please, and who are you, sir?